Hi. Okay, so this video I want to talk about the Edwardians. Who are the Edwardians? Well, in our textbook division, they show up in this book, right? Our third and final book. And they kind of exist in a period of time that has, quite honestly, been a bit idealized in pop culture and literature. Think Downton Abbey. So, it's basically that kind of, at least as we look at it maybe nowadays, right? It's that kind of high point of English society, English power in the early part of the 20th century before World War I. Because, of course, World War I changes things immensely. Okay. Now, that's kind of a rough cut of what we're looking at. But when we look at the particular writers this week, okay, and I'm talking about Thomas Hardy, talking about A.E. Hausmann, and also to a smaller extent, Wilfred Owen, okay, they're kind of different. They're all different from each other. They don't have a lot of commonalities, but there are a few things that we can kind of talk about. First of all, with Thomas Hardy, and I think what's really interesting about Thomas Hardy is if you look at the difference between when he was writing his poems and when they were published, it's decades. Decades and decades. So he, for instance, is writing some of the poems that we're most interested in shortly after the American Civil War, right? And yet not like Hap, published in 1898, right? Over 30 years after its original writing. Look at The Darkling Thrush is written at the turn of the century, meaning, of course, the 19th to the 20th century. Okay. He does also have the piece about the Titanic, the convergence of the twain, which, of course, is a bit later in time, right? 1912. Right? All of which is to go to point to a philosophy or a picture of the world. Now, Hardy is probably best known for his novels. We're not reading any of his novels in our class because obviously we are limited in our time. But the poetry that he writes, it's kind of a tough go. That is to say, if we read Greenblatt, right? Greenblatt passage, he says that Hardy believed himself to be a Millerist, right? I'm going to quote from our textbook, page 35. Hardy denied that he was a pessimist, calling himself a Millerist, that is, one who believes that the world can be made better by human effort. But there is little sign of Millerism in either his fiction or his poetry. In other words, yeah, Thomas might have wanted to think of himself in a certain way. But as we read these pieces, it's pretty hard to get away from the idea of pessimism. Okay. Channel firing, that's the other one that I'm sorry, I passed over that one. 19. It's as though Hardy anticipates this change of time, okay, as the movement from the 19th to the 20th century with dread. This is not an unusual feeling, by the way. What's sometimes using the French term, the fin de siècle, and if I mispronounced that, you'll understand that I don't know French whatsoever. But the end of the century. Fin de siècle thought was not overwhelmingly positive because the influences that would ultimately erupt into World War I, or the Great War as they called it at that time, were already in place. Nationalism, the expansion into colonies around the world, and you had these European nations like Great Britain, France, Germany, uh, to a lesser extent, places like Italy, Holland, Russia, Portugal, of course, and Spain to a lesser extent by that time. But all these European nations were competing with each other. And it just didn't seem like it was going to take all that much, right? For the powder keg to get blasted off. So, as we all know from our good public school educations, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was Austro-Hungarian royalty, was the shot that started World War I. But truthfully, the influences were already there, right? I mean, it's not like everything's totally peaceful and then all of a sudden some royal person gets killed and everybody's at war, right? No, I mean, these things were building and building and building, and that was just the last straw, so to speak. Now, one of the things about Hardy, and then I'll move along, one of the things about Hardy is, of course, his poetry, as I said, is kind of negative, but it also really emphasizes certain kind of qualities of chance and the question of fate, the idea that was this really how things were supposed to be? Did it have to kind of go this way? One of the things that seems very evident to me is the absence of a divine, the absence of a God who loves and cares. Okay, there may be a powerful figure, as for instance we see in Hap, but that powerful figure is no concern for human life, right? Or in Channel Firing, where God is practically a jokester, okay, who again does not intercede in human foibles, right? As the run-up to World War I makes evident there's going to be all kinds of killing, and God's just not going to do anything about it, right? It's just going to happen. There's in Convergence of the Twain, right, the story of the Titanic, right, there's this issue of pride, human pride, and the folly of human pride. So under Hardy, we often and frequently see this kind of pessimistic tone. I agree with Greenblatt. It's hard to find the meliorism per se. I mean, maybe we can if we look hard enough. But what we really see, I think most of the time in his poetry, is a sense of loss, is a sense that the future is not bright, but actually is very, very dark. And that human behavior gives us no real cause for hope. That's fun. A.E. Hausmann is one of our other great poets of this time. And I hope, again, you read his bio that is put together for him. Hausmann is connected to classicism. And indeed, he relies on classical knowledge, or knowledge of the classics, I should say, in a lot of his poetry. Makes a lot of allusions to Greek and Roman literature and culture. His writing is, in many ways, very traditional. In some ways, he's arguably the most traditional in terms of form and structure, laying out regular rhymes, regular line forms. He's very, very tight in that respect. He would almost, I think, be very comfortable, for instance, writing alongside Alexander Pope or a person of that era where they were very structured. I'm talking about now, the 18th century, or John Dryden in the late 17th century. The idea that, poetry would be very, very regimented. It's got to rhyme. Moon, June, spoon, rune, right? It's all, there. But even with that sort of sense that you might be kind of tightened in by some of the formalism of Hausmann. Where he goes, I think, is often very interesting. Kind of looking at human nature. And my favorite poem, and honestly one of my favorite works of the entire semester, is Terence, This Is Stupid Stuff, which in our textbook is on page 134. Terence, by the way, is the name of an old Roman poet. He's borrowing that name, basically, as sort of a pseudonym. And there's a discussion. And the discussion really is between one character whose voice we hear at the beginning of the poem, and then the other character who's the voice of the poet as a response. And the initial character he asks a question that actually you may have asked if you've read enough literature in literature classes. And that question is, why is it always about such downer stuff? Right? Why is it always such a down? Why are the great works of Shakespeare, the greatest works of Shakespeare, considered to be his tragedies? Why not the comedies? Yes, we have the comedies. We love the comedies. We maybe even study the comedies. When people talk about the greatest works, though, they're always talking about the tragedies. Hamlet, Lear, Othello, Macbeth, right? They're always going to the tragedies. Why is that? Why has it always got to be the negative stuff? I mean, we just talked about Thomas Hardy, right? And all the kind of negative downer poetry that he writes. And this poem, in many ways, stands as an answer to that. Why do we look at the negative? Right? What do we see when we look to the negative as opposed to, the Hallmark card poetry? Right? Why does it always have to be so? I know when I was a student, I had that same feeling. It's like, geez, where are the happy stories? There are no happy stories in lit class. Something like that. Lastly is Dulce et Decorum Est, which is by Wilfred Owen. And Dulce et Decorum Est is Latin, which is translated in your text a little differently than how I would translate it, of course, with my in-depth Latin knowledge. They said it is sweet and meet to die for one's country. I would change the word meet to say wonderful. It is sweet and wonderful to die for one's country. In other words, sending young men off to war at the beginning of World War I with this, flag-waving, patriotic, we're going to go make the world safe for democracy. The war will be over in 6 weeks. We'll all be back. It'll be like a nice camping trip through France, and we'll get rid of the Hun. We'll kill off the Germans and all their associated allies, and we'll make everything grand. It'll be a wonderful time. It'll be a picnic in France. Wilfred Owen brings us to this and says, no. Modern war, and frankly, war was never a picnic, right, by definition, for crying out loud. But the modern war, and in this poem particularly, we experience the effects of a gas attack. Okay, a gas attack. And what happens to the human body. And it's very ugly. And it's very brutal. All right. All my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. Right? The metaphor of drowning in the gas attack is an apt one because the lungs are filling up, and that is what actually happens to the soldier. The soldier dies basically of drowning in his own fluids, in his lungs. It's a horrible thing, right? Structurally, technically, again, an incredibly fine poem. Look at the use of sound, assonance, and consonants, right? The repetition of consonant sounds, the repetition of vowel sounds, right? The alliteration, things of that nature, right? As well as traditional end rhymes. There is a sense when you read this poem of the sound and the meaning are combined, kind of like what Tennyson did, right, in the Lotus Eaters. He does a very good job in the Lotus Eaters of doing that well.